Resident Evil is turning out to be one of the most hyped horror games of all time, with everybody's favorite rookie cop, Leon Kennedy, returning to the game combined with a horror-focused story of Grace Ashcroft, plus the amount of fan service thanks to the return to Raccoon City. Yeah, fans are beyond hyped for this next installment of Resident Evil. And thanks to Capcom, your boy was able to get an early copy of the game a whole 10 days before its release, which allowed me to fully submerge myself into the game for the last week or so, while also avoiding all of those pesky spoilers out there. This means I have plenty of time to explore and play every single aspect of Resident Evil Requiem before finalizing my thoughts on the game and giving you guys my honest review of Resident Evil Requiem. Is it a massive disappointment, or is it the survival horror masterpiece that we've all been hyping it out to be? Time to find out, and don't worry, this video will be completely spoiler free. So a few notes on how I ended up playing through Requiem for my first playthrough. Firstly, my review copy was for the PlayStation 5, and I'm happy to report that I didn't run into a single performance issue on my end. Also, as noted in previous trailers, you can play the game at both first person and third person for both protagonists of the game. I ended up going with the recommended settings for my first playthrough, which was Leon third person and Grace first person. Finally, as a fan of old school survival horror, I went with classic standard difficulty, which meant that Grace would need to find or craft ink ribbons and save on a typewriter, adding an additional level of survival horror to Grace's gameplay. Last thing I want to address in my review, out of respect for Capcom's wishes when they gave me this review copy, I won't be showing any gameplay in Raccoon City. I'll still talk about and go over some of my favorite and least favorite parts without touching on spoilers, of course, but gameplay wise, you'll just have to wait for the game to release in a few days from now. But with the settings of how I play the game out of the way, let's jump straight into my experience with Requiem. The main campaign of Requiem is split between Grace and Leon, with Leon getting roughly around 60% of the game and Grace getting about 40-ish% of the game. Obviously, these numbers could vary for each of you depending on what elements of Requiem you personally struggle more on. Also, each half of the game leans towards a different protagonist for a majority of the time. For example, Rhodes Hill was mostly all Grace with very little gameplay for Leon, while the opposite is true with Raccoon City. I didn't hate this idea, as obviously Raccoon City was more important to Leon's history, so exploring most of the ruined Midwestern town as Leon definitely made a lot more sense. I think the best way to really dive into the gameplay of Requiem is to split it into two parts, Grace versus Leon. Starting with Grace, I'll admit that my biggest concern coming into this game was how slow and boring Grace's sections in the game would feel compared to Leon's action horror focused campaign. With that being said, I'm happy to say that I don't think that was the case at all. In fact, I would argue that Grace's sections in the game, specifically Rhodes Hill, were honestly my favorite parts of the game. Because Grace's sections focus heavily on survival horror, a lot of the traditional mechanics seen in classic survival horror games were here. Limited resources, a lack of weapons and ammo to kill enemies, inventory management with only 8 inventory slots at the start of the game, a bigger focus on stealth and avoiding combat versus fighting monsters, and even classic Resident Evil tropes like an inventory box and a typewriter that uses ink ribbons to save. It was all there. However, there were a few other things that really elevated her gameplay experience. For one, the zombies in Resident Evil Requiem, especially the Rhodes Hill section of the game, were different from previous zombies of the series so far. This time, as seen in the trailers, each zombie had a unique personality trait that was inspired from their occupation before they died. For example, a maid zombie still obsessed with cleaning, or a chef still running his kitchen. There were a lot of these unique zombies scattered throughout Rhodes Hill, and when playing as Grace, you were able to admire them a lot more than as Leon. Also, every single monster, including traditional zombies, pose a threat to Grace. Because she doesn't have nearly enough supplies to take down all of the enemies, a single zombie could end your run immediately if you're not careful. This increases the threat level for her sections and creates a more thrilling and terrifying experience overall. Grace wasn't completely defenseless, and she had a few additional perks that Leon didn't. For one, she had a crafting system that used the infected's blood. This blood could be collected from corpses, buckets, and other containers to fill a harvester. Then, using this harvester, Grace can craft all sorts of resources, ammo, knives, and even ink ribbons if you needed them. However, the most useful item that she could craft was this hemolytic injector. These injectors are arguably the most game-breaking tool in Grace's arsenal. With these, she's able to perform stealth takedowns on every single traditional zombie in Rhodes Hill. On top of that, this injector served a second purpose. She could prevent the creation of blister heads. Now, blister heads were Requiem's throwback to one of the most terrifying enemies ever in the franchise's history, Crimson Heads. These super zombies appeared in 2002's Resident Evil Remake, and essentially, they would resurrect from corpses of zombies you killed throughout the Spencer mansion. Blister heads were just like Crimson Heads, only more deadly. If they managed to grab a hold of you, they could instantly kill you, so keeping your distance or killing them as soon as possible was ideal. Going back to the injectors I mentioned earlier, using these on zombies and stealth takedowns, or even the corpses on the ground would eliminate the zombie completely, preventing a blister head from spawning in its place later in the game. Grace also had a unique shop as well called the Parlor. Throughout Rhodes Hill, Grace would collect and find antique coins similar to the ones from Resident Evil 7. Like that game, she could exchange these coins for resources that would improve her odds of surviving. For example, you could buy a heal pouch to increase inventory space, or steroids to increase your max health. From a story point of view, Grace, at least in my opinion, was the more interesting protagonist. Her story and the mystery surrounding her past was without a doubt one of the most exciting aspects of the game to explore. She's someone that I feel like will connect with a lot of us on a more personal level, and I'm really looking forward to each of you getting to know her a little more throughout the story in Requiem. Now, before moving on to Leon's side of the game, let's talk about the negatives for Grace. First off, I can't help but feel a little disappointed in how short her sections were in the game. Don't get me wrong, Rhodes Hill was a masterpiece, and honestly, I think this location might end up being one of my new favorite locations in the series. However, the second half of Requiem really drops off for her character. She doesn't do much in the second half of the game, and that's a shame because honestly, her sections in Rhodes Hill were easily my favorite parts of the entire game. Another downside of the playable Grace sections was a severe lack in enemy variety, especially in terms of the boss fights. On the topic of enemies, I do have one negative thing to mention about the Hag Stalker enemy. I feel like she was definitely underutilized in the game, and we should have seen a lot more of her throughout Requiem. Like for a Stalker enemy, she really didn't stalk us to the levels of previous Stalker enemies in the franchise, such as Jack Baker, Mr. X, or even Nemesis. I also think the crafting system was unnecessary for Grace, considering that her gameplay was heavily inspired by Resident Evil 7 and Outlast, plus the fact that you really didn't have nearly as many enemies to fight against as Leon did. I think the crafting system took away one of the key components of survival horror, limited resources. Finally, I think the thing I was most disappointed with in Grace's campaign was the severe lack of puzzles, especially since Nakanishi directed Resident Evil 7, and in that game he featured a ton of puzzles, including 2 escape room like puzzles. However, in Requiem, if you're expecting difficult puzzles to solve like I was, just don't. You'll be very disappointed. And the very few that you do get are literally so easy a child can solve them. It's like, here's a picture and put the solution here, or here's a key item, use it on this door. As for Leon, his area is focused more on action horror. As I said earlier, the best comparison I can make in terms of Leon's gameplay is a slower paced version of Resident Evil 4 Remake's combat system. I know that might seem bad, but think about it from a logical point of view. Leon is 20 something years older than he was in Resident Evil 4, and on top of that, the guy is suffering from fatigue due to his new infection. Thankfully, his combat system still feels almost as fun as it did in RE4. He's still able to do melee attacks, parry attacks with his Tomahawk axe, and perform stealth takedowns. The counter system from Resident Evil 6 makes its return here. He's also able to pick up enemy weapons like chainsaws and axes and use them to his advantage. He also has environmental attacks, using the area around him to do different takedowns, like pinning a zombie against a wall and then smashing its head in with his foot. In place of his knife, as I mentioned earlier, he has a new Tomahawk axe. However, unlike the knives in Resident Evil 4 Remake, this axe can't ever break. Instead, when the durability of the axe goes down, it just prevents executions and it's a lot weaker. But Leon can quickly sharpen his axe and increase the axe's durability in seconds. I stated earlier, but Leon doesn't save on typewriters with ink ribbons. In fact, until he reaches Raccoon City, his sections of the game uses auto saving only. Once you reach Raccoon City though, you'll have the ability to save manually and use a box that allows you to upgrade your guns and buy resources, but sorry, no merchant this time around. Anyway, if you're someone that likes a lot of fan service, then Resident Evil Requiem is going to be a great game for you. Seriously, the game showers you with Easter eggs, returning enemies, multiple recognizable locations, and even gameplay mechanics that connect to not only other games of the series, but things that we've only seen in the CG films or spin-off games of the franchise. Also, as stated earlier, Grace doesn't have much in terms of enemy variety, but where she lacks, Leon definitely makes up for it big time. I think by my count, there's at least 20 different enemy types in the game, and that's not even including the different variants and personality types for zombies you encounter in Requiem. Looking at some of the things exclusive to the Raccoon City area that I can talk about, but not show, you are able to explore different areas in the city. In fact, there's a whole section that's kind of treated like a semi-open world moment for you to explore before moving into the next area. This area is actually pretty big, but don't expect a massive open world Raccoon City that you can just drive around in. As for a comparison to a previous area in the series, I guess the best I can come up with is the village section in Resident Evil Village, only a little bigger than that. Also, there are some really cool moments and features done with some of the environments while you're exploring it, especially when scaling some of the broken down buildings as they are still falling apart all around you. But honestly, it's one of those things that you'll just have to experience for yourself to really appreciate it versus me actually putting it into words. Now for the negatives in Leon's sections of the game. Now, something I was really disappointed with was the weapon variety for Leon. Maybe I'm being a little too greedy because of Resident Evil 4 Remake, but I definitely expected a little more than what we got. Another disappointing feature was Raccoon City itself. As mentioned earlier, Raccoon City is mostly all Leon. Because of this, I was really hoping for a massive focus on the city itself and having a ton of opportunities to explore different areas from previous games. And while we do get that, it's nowhere near the extent I was hoping for. I think this was a missed opportunity on Capcom's part, considering the fact that they chose to revisit one of the most iconic locations in the series, and what we got, to me, was a little underwhelming. Also, the boss fights were not really all that great. Sure, most of them were great fan service moments for hardcore fans of the series, but from a gameplay side of things, it's hard to ignore the fact that they were just a little lackluster and at times not that creative in the slightest. There are a few exceptions to this though, especially one fight in particular with a certain character that you're all just going to freak out when you see them, but outside of that fight and one other, I can't say that I was all that impressed with the boss fights. In terms of the story, well, I really think this might very well be one of the most divisive Resident Evil games yet, and I'm really interested to see what everybody thinks about it when it's done. Personally, I didn't hate most of the decisions, but there are two choices that honestly I did not like one bit. But with that out of the way, let's get to my final verdict. For better or for worse, Resident Evil Requiem is Capcom's most ambitious game. This ultimately leads to some flaws, most of which is in favor of pushing a little too much fan service our way. But it also creates some really memorable moments and addictive gameplay mechanics. And while there's going to be some conflicting opinions on which part of the game is better, like how I personally feel like Grace's sections are more fleshed out, ultimately I think it's really going to come down to preference and how much you like certain aspects of the series. So some people are going to absolutely hate this game and some might end up loving it. Me? Well, I'm kind of conflicted. To say that I'm disappointed is kind of an understatement because honestly, I did expect a lot more. That being said, it's hard to deny the fact that I had a really great time playing through this game. I might not agree with some of the decisions, but Requiem was still a really fun game to play through, and it's a game that I find myself replaying more than a lot of the other games of the series, like Resident Evil Village or Resident Evil 6. So for that reason, I feel confident in giving Resident Evil Requiem a 7 out of 10. I really enjoy this game, but I definitely can't say that I love it like I do some of the other installments of the franchise. Regardless, I'm going to be providing a lot of coverage on the game after its release, with ranking videos, theory videos, and much more, so be sure to subscribe to the channel for more updates on Resident Evil Requiem. Until then, stay safe, and I'll see you all on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.